So today we'll be talking about education and states and localities. So especially traditionally, education has primarily been handled at the state and local level. So the Department of Education at the national level only came into existence in the late 1970s. So it's still comparatively new in this sense. Now, generally, when we're talking about education, we're speaking specifically about public education. So government schools, education handled by the government itself. And again, this goes back rather far. So textbook mentions the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which in itself was talking about elements of public education. So this is something that's been pretty consistent throughout American history, though public education really starts to become more standardized and ramps up in the late 1800s going into the early 1900s and then beyond from there. Now, one of the big reasons for this is not only the idea that we want an educated citizenry to be more economically viable, but also especially for a democratic republic, constitutional republic, whatever you want to call it, the idea is that education is particularly important for having an educated citizenry. And additionally, especially for a large and heterogeneous sort of society like the United States, the idea is that you need something to kind of civically bind people together. So what do they have in common? And the idea is that public education can serve to help make that sort of educated and unified type of citizenry. Now, this is also something that can make it rather controversial, something we'll talk about in a few minutes. So specifically, what does it mean to make a better type of educated citizenry? What does it mean to try and develop that? Do you focus on American history? If you do, how do you frame it? What's the sort of perspective on it? Do you emphasize things like social justice and activism? Do you emphasize math and science? How do the differences between populations come into play with this? Are they recognized? If so, how do you discuss them? So saying that, yes, we want a unified, educated citizenry is nice and generally something that most people would agree with, but the actual practice of what that means, that's where controversies come in. And again, especially for much of American history, along with just technologically, it was much simpler to try and handle education at the local and especially state levels. The other idea was that because of the kind of variation in the country, a type of one fits all sort of system of education is usually viewed as not really sensible. So for instance, if we're looking at the mid 1800s or even early 1900s, the kind of education that might be useful to say children growing up in a fishing village on the coast of Maine is going to be rather different than what would be useful to say someone living in the Great Plains region in Oklahoma. Obviously, there are going to be differences of what's available to them, or even within one state. So if we take a state like Pennsylvania, students who are being educated in a community of farmers are probably going to have different needs and requirements than, say, children growing up in a mining town in Virginia, forgive me, in Pennsylvania or someplace like that. So this kind of decentralization was initially just a necessity. Now, as America's gotten larger, and especially with technological changes allowing for greater movement, there's been somewhat more of a standardization to a sense of education. But this kind of decentralization still exists and still rather important. Now, briefly kind of going back to something we talked about in the local governments lecture, again, you have school districts, and that tends to be the primary area where public education policy is being handled on a day-to-day basis. Now, this is usually overseen by state departments of education or something similar, and they usually have influence through finances. So effectively for providing money to school districts, that if the school district wants certain money from the state, it's going to have to follow that, or again, just by direct legislation. Now, there is also federal intervention from the national level, but that tends to, while it's increased in the last 20, 30 years, that still tends to be not a primary source for certain things like education policy. It still tends to derive mostly from the states and local governments. And again, school districts usually have an elected school board, and with the school superintendent who acts as basically the day-to-day operator of how things work while the school board handles policy. something we talked about previously in the local government lecture. Now, one of the big things that comes up, especially with schools, is the issue of funding. Because funding can vary greatly between districts, it also changes rather significantly between states. So right now, the national average in the United States for the amount of money spent per student in schools and the public education system is about $12,600 per year. Now, that being said, some states will spend only maybe about $7,000. Other states, so like New York, spend almost double that at $24,000. And this can reflect a lot of things. So it can reflect, say, the general economic wealth of a state. So someplace like New York is obviously going to have much more money to use than, say, South Dakota. How strong teachers' unions are, what kind of funding structures exist, and things like that. That said, one thing that should be noted is there doesn't seem to really be a correlation between higher or lower funding and certain educational outputs, especially something like the SAT scores. So SAT scores are things that usually high schoolers will take. And this tends to be, though it's changing somewhat, tends to be kind of the main testing system for getting into college. This is oftentimes looked at as a primary kind of output for seeing how education is going. So if we look at someplace like New York, it's spends the most on students, and yet it only ranks around 39th in terms of SAT scores. Now, obviously, there could be a lot of factors in this in terms of like how many students are taking the tests, other sort of things of that type. But again, the amount of money doesn't necessarily equate to better outputs in some sense. Now, this also gets to the issue of equality. So we kind of touched on that a little bit when talking about the Texas state constitution. That again, if school districts are getting their funding from property taxes or things like that, poor districts are generally going to have less funding, and this can create kind of a vicious circle, I should say, of where you have poor funding for schools. Schools may have worse outputs in terms of student education, which tends to make that district even more poor, which means it has even less funding to go through and kind of becomes, again, sort of a vicious circle in this sense. So this is why you have places like California or Texas, where their state courts have ruled that you need a more centralized funding system to try and remove or at least mitigate some of these types of inequalities. But there can be other issues. So for instance, people who have no children, especially those who have no intention to have children or maybe are just physically incapable of it, argue that it's unfair that they have to pay for education versus through various taxes, that the idea is they're having to pay into this without getting any benefit. Additionally, those, and say tends to be more of an issue, are those parents who want their children to attend religious schools or parochial schools. Because their argument is, okay, we're paying for our child's education on our own, and yet we're still having to pay for public education that we're not using. We're basically getting double hit in terms of these payments. Now, there are some states where through vouchers, something we'll get to a little later, parents can use that money to send their children to religious schools, Catholic schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, Protestant schools, whatever. Then the issues arise of, does this become a breach of the No Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, which says that a state cannot recognize an official religion in a state or the United States. Under jurisprudence in the United States, it's not just a formal declaration of establishment, but also if the government is giving funding or other sorts of support to a church or religious organization, this can sometimes lead to questions of whether the Establishment Clause has been violated. So with all that in mind, one of the things that becomes rather controversial in many of the discussions about schools is the issue of measurement. So there are various inputs that we can measure. So how much funding is the school getting? How much recent technology do they have? How many teachers are being hired? Things of that sort. But what do we do in terms of determining outputs? So again, the SAT score is one. You could also use things like graduation rates, other sort of tests, looking at things like literacy ability, how good people are at math, things of that type. So in the early 2000s, under the George W. Bush administration, there was an act called the No Child Left Behind Act that passed that tried to have some sort of like national testing to try and measure this, not only say in high school, but at lower levels as well. Where the concern was that, yes, it can measure outputs, but in effect, the teachers are teaching to the test. They're not trying to educate students, they're basically just educating them to be able to do well on a test, because test scores, these outputs would reflect on funding. Now, this tends to cause for some rather acrimonious disputes, especially, and I mean, education in general can cause for these acrimonious disputes, because again, we are talking about the education of the next generation of citizens, and also more specifically, we're talking about people's children. And there's a lot of things that people are willing to tolerate against themselves. Any individual is willing to kind of, sort of grind their teeth through various types of things. But when it comes to their children, people tend to become a lot more, they're a lot less willing to just sort of let things go by. They are much more strongly concerned about things going well. Outputs and measurement being a key one. And here we can look at, say, the differences between teachers' unions and various sort of taxpayer groups. For many teachers' unions, the idea is that strict measurement ideas are unsound. That in effect, the idea is that a teacher, especially in the secondary and primary school levels, not only are they trying to teach reading and math, but they're also trying to teach history, civics, social integration, tolerance, learning to share, all these sort of things that can't really be measured adequately. So how well can one measure whether a teacher is making students more well socially integrated? Even social psychologists would probably have a little bit of trouble trying to figure out a good measurement for that, much less one that could cross the entire country. So the idea is that there are a lot of things teachers are doing that just can't be measured. And that sense, also the idea is that these measurements may be unfair towards teachers. Since generally speaking, one of the main drivers, according to various studies, of student achievement is their home environment. So are things going well at home? Are parents involved? Are they engaged? Things of that type. The idea is that, understandably, teachers don't really have much engagement with that. If a student's coming from a poor home environment, you could be the greatest teacher in the world, and you probably still couldn't do much. So these type of measurements are not really fair towards teachers. Taxpayer groups, on the other hand, say these measurements are very necessary. That especially if you're dealing with demands for increases in funding for schools or something like that, the idea is that, well, taxpayers have a reasonable expectation to see if that money's going anywhere, to see if it's actually helping. So when looking at schools, say in Baltimore or other sort of places where you have students who effectively can't read and can't do basic mathematics and may still be graduating, the idea is that saying, well, we need more money, this is sending good money after bad. If there's something that's going that poorly, even if schools are generally being at least comparatively well funded, it would seem that the teachers or others are where there's a problem arising. So in this view, the idea is that teachers are like anyone else. You have to measure them on success and failure. That therefore measurement is a key element that's necessary because, especially if there are demands for increased funding, we have to see if it's actually going to something worthwhile, is the idea. Now, what also causes controversy, and this is something especially, say if you've seen American news in the last, say, 6 months or probably more like last year and a half, that comes up pretty significantly, say what should actually be taught in schools. So again, things like math and science, yeah, that's usually brought up. But what about other things? So should there be particular tracks in high school for people who want to go into the skilled trades? So for instance, thinking back when I was in high school, there were some individuals like me who said, yeah, the expectation is we're going to try and go to college. Others, for various reasons, said, well, no, I want to become an auto mechanic or an electrician or a plumber or something of that type. The idea is, okay, should there be tracks in high school that would allow students to do that? They're kind of giving sort of pre-vocational training or something of that type. Also, the idea of how much time should be spent on any specific element or area. So how much should be spent on math? How much should be spent on science? How much should be spent on history? How much should be spent on writing? How much should be spent on literature? Things of that type. Again, these sort of detailed questions about, say, if we all say that, yes, we want people who can read and write, great. But we need a little bit more than that in the details of what exactly that specifically means. But additionally, big issues come to things dealing with morals as well as identity. Because again, beyond math and science and writing, there are obviously other topics that are being taught. So if we're looking, say, especially in the last 100 years, one of the big ones that's come up is the issue of sex education. Should schools be teaching children or adolescents about sex? If they are, what should they be teaching them about? So should they be focusing on abstinence, so just not having any sort of sexual activity until marriage, or should they be focusing on birth control? Should they be emphasizing traditional sort of gender roles, or should they be talking about things like homosexuality, transgenderism, and things of that type? This becomes a big debate, frequent debates, because the idea is that, yes, since these are especially touching on rather sensitive topics, and especially ones where there can be dispute between different religious groups or ideological groups, the idea is what exactly are the students being taught? Because it's not like, say, it's not even like, say, in a college, where the idea would be that, okay, there could be open debates and so forth, and that we're dealing with adults. When you're dealing with children, we're not talking about a free speech realm, nor are we talking about individuals who are necessarily cognitively able to make certain types of distinctions. And more to the point, especially inside a school, if you're dealing with a 12 or 13-year-old, the teacher is the main authority. So there's not really discussion as much as there is instruction and more specifically saying this is what it is versus this is what it's not. One of the reasons why this becomes such a debate. This can also touch on things like history. So the 1619 project that some schools have been trying to focus on, which basically frames American history through the lens of the development of slavery and so forth in the United States or in the American colonies. This becomes a pretty good example. So if we're talking about, again, trying to raise educated citizens, what should their view of America be? Should they be viewing America as something that has had a long-standing tension about systemic racism? Should they view it as someplace that focused on one of the first big examples of the country focused on natural rights? How should we look at people in the past? So for instance, let's take an example of someone like Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, one of the members of the founding generation, third president of the United States, author of the Declaration of Independence, things of this type, one of the major figures. If we go back to say like 1920, when there's, say, in a public school or something like that, talking about Thomas Jefferson, the idea would be that Jefferson was like America's philosopher. He was one of the most brilliant minds that existed in his generation. He was a man of many talents, did all these sorts of good things. Because again, especially when you're dealing with kids, obviously history is going to be rather simplified. So what you emphasize kind of varies. Versus say, like maybe 10 years ago, where generally speaking, what was Thomas Jefferson? Yeah, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he tends to be viewed as sort of like a hypocrite, someone who was speaking about freedom while owning slaves, things of this type. What gets emphasized is important, not only because you're trying to shape what people view their country as being like, and therefore what future directions you should take, but also because of the idea, well, it even goes back to something as far as the ancient Greeks. I believe it was Aristotle who noted that the people remember best what they're educated in first. So in effect, the kind of frame that one's getting of American history when you're a kid is probably going to have a substantial influence on how you view, say, American citizenship, the Constitution, the American system from that point forward, without even necessarily thinking about it, because it's just what you grew up with. It's the first things you ran into. Thus why this becomes so controversial. Because the idea is, in fact, you are kind of shaping what your next generation of students, or your next generation of citizens is going to think of their country. One thing that's come up especially in about the last 20, 25 years is the idea of reforming schools. Now, this is especially because of kind of a change that we see. So especially as public education started becoming more available in the 1920s and going forward, you start seeing a pretty good increase in the, say, general reading and mathematics scores of people in the United States. Starting around the 1980s, especially in the 1990s, you start seeing kind of flattening up or even starting to go down. So the idea is that maybe something's gone wrong. So how would you try and modify this? There have been some school-based management ideas, magnet schools, where the idea is you're teaching students kind of in different tracks. So if students seem to have a pretty good inclination towards science, you move them there. If there are students who seem to have say, sort of behavioral or home issues, you'd move them there to try and deal with their special needs, things of that type. Or even say private groups making charter schools, something kind of like, so basically kind of like a religious school, but it's a private group that's not necessarily religiously oriented. Now, one of the most debated ones is the idea of educational vouchers. So the idea with the voucher is that's okay, rather than say the way it's typically been now, where do students go in terms of school? It depends on what school district you live in and where in the school district you specifically live. So even thinking back to when I was a kid, the middle school I went to was about 30 or 40 minutes away from my house. Now there was another middle school that was about 15 minutes away from my house, but because of where I lived and how the districting worked, I was sent to the other middle school because that's just how this is usually organized. The idea with educational vouchers is instead that effectively the amount of money that would be spent per student is given as a voucher to the parents of that child. And the parents will then kind of spend that voucher on a school they would prefer to send them to. So for instance, if that middle school that was near to my house, my parents thought, okay, yeah, I think this would be a better school for our son, they would use that voucher and move me there. Potentially, you could also use this for private schools, religious schools, things of that type. Now, here again is where we get some controversy. Teachers' unions tend to be pretty strongly against vouchers because the idea is they fear that this is going to create vast inequalities between schools. They basically make a sort of tiered system where you have well-funded schools because everyone's sending their kids their vouchers there, and poor schools that just basically get left to the side. And again, starts forming that vicious circle sort of thing. Schools that have more parents sending their students there, have more vouchers, have more money, therefore can build themselves up better. The schools that have less money, they get worse, and the kind of cycle repeats itself. Second issue is just dealing with details. So things like infrastructure. What are you going to do about school buses? How are you going to get these students to each of these schools if they're going everywhere? So how do you deal with transportation, things of that type? Now, there is also a negative side to this, that at least some teacher unions or their representatives have tried to frame this as a class, racial, or religious sort of element, claiming that those who are for vouchers are attempting to harm racial minorities, or that, say, especially for those who want to use these for religious schools, that they're trying to fund bigoted types of curriculums and that sort of thing, using taxpayer money. So basically saying those who are for vouchers are doing so for very invidious, evil sort of reasons. People who are for vouchers tend to argue that this is going to help with competition. One of the biggest problems that schools have today, public schools have, is that there's no competition. If a school is doing really well, it does really well. If it does really poorly, it just does really poorly. But it's not like, say, with businesses. So if I have a coffee shop that's doing really well, it'll get greater profits. If I have a coffee shop that's doing very poorly, people will start going to the better coffee shop and eventually I go out of business. As government entities, schools don't really have that. The idea is vouchers create competition, and therefore that's going to encourage schools to try and innovate as well as try and better themselves. And additionally, this keeps students from being locked into bad schools just by the bad luck of where they live. So rather than harming, say, low-income families, this is actually a benefit for them because this means that they can get out of these bad schools and get moved into better ones. Now, just like with the teachers union side, for those who are pro-vouchers, they also have a negative view. That basically they're saying the teachers unions are actively trying to undermine accountability. And in effect are trying to keep a coercive monopoly. Pardon me. That the idea is that, yeah, of course teacher unions would be against this because it would require them to actually show that they're actually doing something. It shows that it would create accountability, which they don't want. So again, kind of a negative view. Then finally on to college. So many universities are land-grant colleges, public universities. Texas A&M itself is a land-grant college, where the idea is that the federal government would set aside certain land or things like that for the purposes of setting up universities. So the University of Texas and Texas A&M are both examples of this. Now, universities have especially expanded in the period after the Second World War. So One of the things that happened after the Second World War was the GI Bill, which basically said that if you served in the military for a certain amount of time, the US government would pay towards your college education. So that increased the number of people going to college. General wealth also increased. Also during things like the Vietnam War, many people would go to college because you could get a deferment from being drafted into the military if you were in college. And then also things like judicial tests, issues on tests. So certain types of tests have been ruled discriminatory by various courts. So oftentimes businesses now use a college degree as kind of a proxy for a test. This has increased the number of people going to college, has increased the number of people graduating from college, which has benefits and demerits. So one of the biggest things is the cost. That the cost of college has increased substantially more than inflation over the last 30 and 40 years. And yet schools are still running short on money. And there are a couple of reasons for this, various ones. One is that you just have larger schools that cost more money. More students tend to cost more money, as well as, say, the number of administrators. The number of administrators have increased substantially in universities. And this is even the case when you're dealing with things like private universities. I think there was a study that just came, or a news story that just came out about a week ago, that Yale University, one of the top private universities, has 6,000 students and 5,000 administrators. So almost a 1-to-1 ratio of administrators to students. Obviously, that increases overhead pretty badly. Another issue that universities are running into is measurement, but of a different type. So especially for major universities, research universities, if they're looking at, say, how well or poorly a professor is doing, how they're measuring it, usually they're measuring this in terms of like, okay, what kind of research grants are you getting? How much are you getting? How many publications are you doing? Things like that. While how you're doing and teaching with undergraduate students is usually kind of secondary. So especially if you're trying to go for, so in many departments, say back on main campus, if you're trying to become a tenured professor, so if you're trying to get promotion, if you're the best teacher in the world, but you don't publish anything, you're not going to get promoted. Versus if you publish very well, but you're kind of a bad teacher, as long as you're not doing something criminal, you're probably still going to get promoted. This is kind of an issue because for taxpayers and especially for parents, the issue of measurement is how well are your students doing? Are they graduating? Are they able to find jobs afterwards? While research and that sort of thing is kind of more secondary, especially if you're dealing with things outside of the physical sciences. Then finally, one other big issue is debt. Student debt has become a major issue. The national government subsidizes student loans. So this basically ensures that banks will give loans to students for college because the idea is that if they default, the national government will pay the bank back. So the banks basically have nothing to lose. But this becomes kind of a vicious cycle. So if the national government is going to say, offer $12,000 per year for a student in terms of subsidized loans to go to college, universities are aware of this. So they'll kind of raise the price to, instead of 12,000 to 15,000. So eventually the government rises it up to 15. Universities then raise it up to 18. It kind of goes on and on and on. This is particularly an issue now if university graduates can't find work. Previously, the idea was that a university degree was pretty much your segue into a job in a middle-class life. Now you have more people who can't find jobs. This is particularly an issue because of the kind of debt student loans are. So yes, they're subsidized by the national government, which means students who generally couldn't have gotten loans without this can get them. They can go to college. One of the downsides with this is, so we mentioned at the beginning of the semester the idea of bankruptcy laws. One of the quirks about student loans, subsidized student loans by the national government, is they cannot be removed by bankruptcy proceedings. If you go bankrupt, you are still required to pay back your loans. Now, there are various things that kind of, where depending upon your need, if you basically haven't been able to get employed, they may lower it down to the point where you're paying very little or nothing at all for a while. But you always are going to have that debt. Unlike, say, if I go bankrupt and I have, say, $30,000 worth of credit card debt, after going through the bankruptcy proceedings, that debt is wiped out. If I have $30,000 worth of student loan debt and I go through a bankruptcy proceeding, I still have that debt I need to pay off at some point. This has created kind of a debt servitude problem, where you have Various individuals who are educated, who have gotten a college degree, can't find work, or at least can't find work that's beyond, say, something like, say, being a barista or something like that, so something they could have gotten just with a high school degree, and yet owe tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. That can have some pretty nasty social ramifications. I mean, it's not gotten to that point in the US yet, but I mean, if we look to, say, other types of societies, one of the things that can create a more sort of destabilizing or even revolutionary sort of situation is if you have a group of people who are highly credentialed who can't find work, because they tend to have a large amount of resentment against society, and they also tend to be educated enough to know how to try and radically change things, which is not a preferable situation in most cases. But there are others as well in terms of influences this is happening. So for instance, you're seeing much more of a focus now on some of the skilled trades. So saying instead of going to college, focus on things like maybe community college, or focus on more skilled trades like electronics, welding, air conditioning maintenance, things of that type, mechanics. Because the idea is that this is something you're always going to still have to work with, and therefore will be beneficial to do. And we managed to get through it all today. This is one of the first lectures we managed to get through entirely in the correct amount of time, even shorter than normal. Wow, that's unique, almost disconcerting. Well, with that being the case, we'll turn off the recording, then we'll go to any sort of questions. So just one moment.